Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepys, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Amanda Coplin, the author of the acclaimed novel The Orchardist. An alumna of the University of Oregon's creative writing program, Coplin went on to earn her MFA at the University of Minnesota. She was a visiting assistant professor at the U of O during the 2014 fall term. Thank you, Amanda, for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Your book's been characterized as a stunning debut. So what sparked its birth? How did you come to write this book?
Well, I think the book sort of took form while I was a graduate student in Minnesota. But it goes far back to when I was a child growing up in Wenatchee, Washington. I've always been fascinated and enthralled with the landscape there. And that's something that has been with me from the very beginning, and I didn't know how to write about it until, I was 22, 23 years old. So I had to figure out a way to write about that place I loved so much, and I felt I was capable at a certain point. And then I learned that I was not capable. And so I had to work, for almost a decade to get this novel out. So that's how it started.
So can you give us a very quick snapshot of the plot?
Well, the book is about primarily a man named William Talmadge. He grows up in Central Washington, where the place where I was just talking about, in and around Wenatchee, Washington. And it's about his life from the middle of the 1800s to around the turn of last century. He's a very lonely man. He doesn't have a family for most of his life. When he's in his mid-40s, he encounters two runaway pregnant teenage girls, and he tries to care for them. And the novel is about their relationship and about the relationship between Talmadge and one of the children that we see later on in the book.
So I understand you're willing to read a passage for us.
Of course. I'll read from the very beginning, so I won't ruin anything for people who have not read it. His face was as pitted as the moon. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and thick without being stocky, though one could see how he would pass into stockiness. He had already taken on the barrel-chested sturdiness of an old man. His ears were elephantine, a feature most commented on when he was younger, when the ears stuck out from his head. But now they had darkened like the rest of his sun-exposed flesh and lay against his skull more than at any other time in his life, and were tough, the flesh granular like the rind of some fruit. He was clean-shaven, large-pored. His skin was oily. In some lights his flesh was gray, others tallow, others red. His lips were the same color as his face, had given way to the overall visage, had begun to disappear. His nose was large, bulbous. His eyes were cornflower blue. His eyelashes nothing to speak of now, but when he was young they were thick black, and his cheeks bloomed, and his lips were as pure and sculpted as a cherub's. These things together made the women compulsively kiss him, lean down on their way to do other chores, collapse him to their breasts. All his mother's sisters he could no longer remember, from Arkansas, who were but shadows of shadows now in his consciousness. "Oh, my lovely," they would say, "oh, my sweet lamb." His arms were sun-darkened and flecked with old scars. He combed his hair over his head, a dark, sparse wing kept in place with pine-scented pomade. He regarded the world, objects right in front of his face, as if from a great distance. For when he moved on the earth, he also moved in other realms. In certain seasons, in certain shades, memories alighted on him like sharp-taloned birds, a head turning in the foliage, lantern light flaring in a room. And there were other constant preoccupations he likewise half acknowledged, in which his attention was nevertheless steeped at all times. Present and past projects in the orchard, desires he had had as a young man, worries, fears of which he remembered only the husks, trees he had hoped to plant, experiments with grafting and irrigation, jam recipes, cellar temperatures, chemical combinations for poisoning or at least discouraging a range of pests, deer and rabbits and rodents and grubs, a universe of insects, how to draw bees. Important was the weather and patterns of certain years, the likelihood of repetition meteorologically speaking, what that would mean for the landscape, the wisdom of the almanacs, the words of other men, other orchardists, the unimportant but mostly the important words. He thought of where he would go hunting next fall, consider constantly the state of his land, his property, his buildings, his animal. And mostly he thought of the weather that week, the temperature and existence of or potential for rainfall, recent calamities and how he was responding to them, the position of the season, his position in the rigid scaffolding of chores, what he would have to do that day, that afternoon and evening, how he would prepare for the next morning's work. When were the men coming and would he be ready for them? But he would be ready for them. He always was. He was nothing if not prepared. He considered those times in his life when he had uttered words to a person, Carolyn Mitty or Clee or his mother or a stranger who had long forgotten him, he wished he had never uttered, or had uttered differently. Or he thought of the times he remained silent when he should have spoken as little as a single word. He tried to recollect every word he had ever spoken to his sister, tried to detect his own meanness or thoughtlessness, his own insensitivity to certain inflections she might have employed. How long ago it was now. At times he fretted about forgetting her, though in fact he did not like to admit this. He had already forgotten much.
Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
That's
Thank
such
you.
a great opening, and it just, immediately makes you want to just keep reading.
Oh, perfect.
So one of the many striking things about the novel overall, but it's already very clear in this passage that you just read, is how you combine these very precise and naturalistic descriptions of people, their bodies, and their settings, with equally rich expressions of their inner lives, as you do here. Why is that approach something that's important to you?
Well, I think basically it just feels very honest, like that's how things work, And I think that's how it works in my own experience. I often feel that certain thoughts or emotions are drawn from me by my physical surroundings, by landscape. And also, it's true of everything that has moved me in literature. Virginia Woolf, I think, is sort of the master of this, of when you read one of her novels, you get a very rich sense of both the inner and outer landscape of the character and, the place in which the character is moving. And I always was very, very moved by that. When I read her, I read her all the time.
Same.
She never gets old.
She never gets old,
No.
That's true. So you've already alluded to, and it's also clear in the passage, the importance of place and landscape in the story. It's very precisely located in place, in landscape. Why is that emphasis on setting so important to you? What is it? I mean, you've suggested that landscape shapes in a certain way characters. Is that what that's about? Why that's so important for you?
I mean, I don't think this is something that I chose. I didn't think, I'm going to be a writer who is particularly sensitive to landscape or a particular landscape. This is something that has a truth that has haunted me from the very beginning. I mean, when I was a child, I spent a lot of time in my grandparents' orchards just outside of Wenatchee, and I knew even then that was a very special place. And I think it's that particular place, but it's also just being in the natural world, and that's kind of a strange, I think, phrase, like the natural world, like what's an unnatural environment, or I mean, there is an unnatural environment, such thing as that. But when people say the natural world, I feel like they're often talking about being in a forest or being in a particular wild environment. And the orchards where I grew up, they were definitely they were kind of a mixture of, there was vegetation, there was a lot of fruit, there was a lot of vegetables, a lot of greenery, but there was also, everything was influenced by man. These are orchards. This is a landscape that was not naturally supposed to produce all that fruit. And so I was interested in that tension too between, there was a landscape that I loved that wasn't quote unquote natural, and what did that mean? So I was interested in exploring that. But I think that a lot of people, especially today, are thirsty for those kinds of feelings, of those mysterious, rich biological feelings that you get when you go for a hike. I mean, that's simplifying it. But when you go into a place that you don't understand, if you go into a natural biological ecosystem, it affects you as an animal, and it affects your mind. And I'm interested in the art that comes from that.
So the story is quiet, very quiet in some ways, but also really intense at the same time. So a lot of the characters are pretty silent and inarticulate people, but they experience this wide range of quite powerful emotions. The interest and your ability to sort of access the rich inner lives of these fairly inarticulate people. I mean, he's a really silent guy in a lot of ways. Tell us where that interest comes from, that interest in this sort of less than, I mean, Virginia Woolf has a lot of really articulate characters,
Right.
And these characters are not those kinds of characters.
I mean, again, it comes from my own experience, and also because I've been a reader for my entire life, I feel like I count as my experience all the books that I've read too. So, I grew up with, in my family there are a lot of talkers, but they're usually the women. The women, we all get together and there's a lot of female voices going on, and the men are usually quieter. And that was certainly true of my grandfather, whom the character Talmadge is based on. There was a lot going on. You could tell, because when he did speak, it was often this condensed, sort of profound, he didn't speak in maxims or anything like that, but when he spoke, you often remembered, what he said. And he had a really wonderful sense of humor, but there wasn't a lot of speaking going on. And, for a lot of people in my family and a lot of people who I grew up with, they weren't, spouting off their philosophies or anything like that. But of course, everyone has a philosophy, even if they don't know how to articulate it in words. And I really, because of my own personal experience in that way, I really responded to Faulkner when I started reading Faulkner's novels. He's plumbing the consciousnesses of these people who would never do so themselves, in the way that, like, Faulkner's artistry and how he does that. I was totally blown away by that. And so I really studied him, particularly Light in August, for, how do you really go into a person's consciousness and their interior life, and use language that they would never use, and how do you do that successfully? You don't want to sort of talk down to the character. You don't want to say, oh, I'm this smart narrator or author with all this, vocabulary and terms that this person, an educated person, wouldn't know. You never want to have the book come off as sounding like that. So that was sort of the point of the book too, to give voice to people who wouldn't necessarily speak.
Well, you do it with amazing skill. It's
thank you.
Really quite impressive.
Thank you.
You've evoked so far Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner, so my area of specialty is modernism, so I teach those guys all the time. And one of the things I think that's interesting about the book is that it's not a book that I would say, if I were going to give it to a student, when you start reading this, you're going to think, what? But you do use certain techniques, and you've talked about them already, that are experimental or that follow in the line from people, experimental writers like Woolf and Faulkner. One of the things in this regard that's notable is that you do not use quotation marks. So why not?
Well, I think the most direct answer would be that when I first started writing the book, I was reading a lot of Cormac McCarthy, and I was very sensitive when I first started writing to emulate, I tried to emulate Faulkner and Woolf and Cormac McCarthy, and so to do that as closely as I could, I just didn't use quotation marks because I was trying to do a certain thing and sound a certain way. And at a certain point in the writing process, one of my friends said, people are going to ask you about
ask you this question.
Everyone
has asked you this
and
question.
some people accept it and keep reading, and it becomes part of the, one of the things you do as a reader is you accept certain things. And other people cannot handle it, which I understand because I have those sort of biases as a reader too. So when my friend suggested, why don't you put some, why don't you use punctuation and use those, dialogue markers, I put them in, and as soon as I put them in, they sort of screamed on the page. I felt like I had grown used to not using them, and so when I used them, I felt like the characters were shouting whenever they started speaking. And so it was something that, if I put them in, I would have to rewrite entire passages to accommodate that one change. And I thought, even if I think this is a mistake later, which I don't, I feel like it's proper for the book, it's too late. It's too late now. That ship has sailed. This book will not have, dialogue markers at all. So that's what happened.
For me, the thing that's great about that decision is that it makes us, when we read, have to read with real closeness. And so much of the book is about intimacy with these people, people that many of us wouldn't feel familiar with, that you're suddenly and this is, Faulkner does this all the time, gets you intimate with people that are not not the people that you're typically intimate with.
Right.
But that you have to read slowly and carefully to accommodate that lack of conventional punctuation. But I think it's effective as a technique. Did you do any research for this book?
I did a lot of research, but I feel like I did it my own way. I kind of immersed myself in all kinds of material. I read a lot of journal accounts from primarily women who were homesteading. Their husbands died, their families died, and they sort of had to figure out how to live. And those stories are horrifying. It's one story after another. And I did a lot of, reading about that particular place and about the native cultures and what the landscape was like and what the white settlement looked like. And then I took all these notes and then I sort of put them away and, quote unquote, forgot about them. I'm not the kind of person who will fold in interesting details just to sort of say, look, I did research. I'm the real deal kind of thing, And there's a lot of, there's a lot of historical inaccuracies and geographical inaccuracies that people really like to point out and write me long emails about. But that's a whole other interesting conversation to have, is what is your responsibility as a writer when you're writing about a place that exists? Do you have to be faithful to fact or history? And I, of course, as a fiction writer, I don't think you do. But as a quote unquote historical fiction writer, people start to have certain expectations, and so that's very interesting. But yeah.
The two orphan girls, they're escapees from a brothel. Is that a historical reality? Were there a lot of
No.
brothels? Okay.
I mean, it's so funny because I did do research into sex workers around that particular time. And honestly, the only thing that I could find were descriptions of like female-run brothels in the Seattle area who serviced mainly people who were men who were working in the lumber industry. And, it was a very sort of, I mean, I don't want to go as far as call it total sex positive, but it was sort of like, these madams were running the brothels and they were interested in getting paid. And,
Successful businesswomen.
successful. And there wasn't any sort of awful brothel, it's even to call it a brothel, it's like a sort of a sex slavery thing in the woods, deep in central Washington. And I didn't find anything like that, thank God. So.
So you said it took you about a decade to write the book?
About 8 years, yeah.
So why did it, tell us a little bit about that protracted, what happened there?
Well, I mean, I sort of was bitten by this idea, which I think is actually what has to happen, for someone to feel excited for 8 years to write something, a big project like this. You have to feel compelled to work on it for that long. And I certainly was. I mean, I was excited the whole time. I mean, the whole time. I was depressed and sort of terrified for a part of it, but also there was this great excitement that was carrying me along. I wanted to tell this particular story, and also I was just very interested in writing a novel. I mean, what more exciting thing could you ever hope to do? I mean, it's just this huge, complicated thing full of all kinds of possibilities. And sometimes I think why it took 8 years is because I fell in love with possibilities, and I fell in love with authors I was reading, like Woolf and Faulkner and McCarthy and Toni Morrison, and I would read Beloved and I would say, oh, this structure is interesting. It speaks to me. I wonder if I should rewrite the 250 pages I have, and and then of course it would hit a dead end because my Morrison draft, because I'm not Toni Morrison. It's too bad. But I would just have to sort of rely on my own vision, which was developing, and so it was sort of a meandering experience.
Well, the voice is very distinctive. I mean, it's interesting to hear you say that so much of your process is by reading other
of course,
great authors.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem to me in any way that this book is derivative. It doesn't feel that way. Your voice is very distinctive. You're an alumna of undergrad alumna of the University of Oregon.
Yes.
When you were here, then you were involved in the Kid Tutorial Program.
Yes, yes.
What's the Kid Tutorial Program, and how did it help you?
Well, the Kid Tutorial Program is a program, it's a year long, and it's sort of an intense, writing intensive program for undergraduates. I think you have to apply, you fill out your application and submit work maybe. I don't remember how it works exactly. And you meet, I think it's once a week, and you have a very small class headed by a graduate student in creative writing. And then every once in a while you get together. There are sort of maybe like 9 groups or so, 9 little tutorials, and then every once in a while you get together as a large group and you get to hear special visitors who come speak at the university. They have sort of a special time with just the kid students, and they have a competition every year where you turn in your stories and your poems, and a visiting writer will choose the winners. And when I was an undergraduate, it was, I knew I wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to write as much as possible while I was here. And so I was an English major, and I took, creative writing classes all the time. I think I took maybe some more than once, which drove my parents crazy, but they let me do it, so I got away with it. And the Kid was very exciting for me. Because I remember we read texts that were over my head, and that was difficult, but in a good way, where you thought, I don't understand this now, but maybe I will in 10 years or something. And people treated us Shelley Withrow was in charge of it that year that I participated, and I remember she treated us like adults, like, that we had already written something of value, and that was very, very important to me.
Did you win that competition?
I won the competition my junior and senior years, and actually I think my junior year, Charles Baxter was visiting, and he had just published his collection, Burning Down the House, the essays on fiction writing, which I didn't understand. He came in and read, and I thought, I have no idea what he's talking about. But I knew that he was brilliant, and so I won the fiction competition that year and went to Prince Puckler's and had ice cream with him, and I was terrified. And I said, I'm going to come study with you, and he was starting in Minnesota the next year, so he said, no one knows this, but I'm transferring, so you should apply there. And I did, and I saw him. I got in, and I saw him the first week. I was walking down the hallway, and I said, Charles Baxter, it's me. And he said, who? Who are you? And I said, oh. So he didn't remember me, but I got to study with him, and it was amazing. He's just a wonderful, wonderful teacher.
Have you been working on a new project?
Well, I've been working on something. I don't know what's going on with that. I feel as long as I'm working every day and I'm feeling, or nearly every day, and feeling excited, if I have that excitement, then I tell myself everything is fine. But I feel like, this book, it took so much out of me, and it was so much about my life, my interior life and my childhood, that I feel like I have to tap into either that same well or find something else. I'm doing a lot of tapping.
So during your tapping, have you come across any books recently, one book that you would recommend for our viewers that you've recently read?
Oh my gosh.
And it doesn't have to be a new book.
Yeah, a new book. I probably have, and that question always stuns me because I get so excited, my brain just stops. There's a book I've been wanting to tell the graduate students who I'm working with. I brought it in. It's called Death in Spring. It's by this woman named Mercé Rodoreda, and it was recently reissued by this press called Open Letter Press in Rochester, New York, and they put out books that have fallen out of print. And this book is amazing. It's a short novel, and it's sort of, it's like a big sort of poetic fable, and it's absolutely gorgeous and devastating and has all the wonderful things.
Death in Spring.
Death in Spring.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for that recommendation. Thank you for speaking with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I've been speaking with Amanda Coplin, Coplin,
Yes.
author of The Orchardist. She'll give a reading on November 6, 2014 as part of the Creative Writing Program's annual reading series. Thanks so much for joining us today.